Okay. My opponent's name was David, and his topic was performance-enhancing drugs, also known as PEDs. His major claim is that the use of performance-enhancing drugs is detrimental to the careers of professional athletes. His secondary claims are that there is unwanted pressure on athletes to use PEDs, and PED use has a negative effect on the health of athletes. My secondary claims are that David's arguments could have been made stronger if he used more relevant information and addressed important controversies on the subject. So my first claim is that the argument could use more relevant information. For example, David cites that the Digital Citizens Alliance found that 40% of males believe that the use of PEDs is the only way to make it professionally. However, this percentage is not relevant because it is less than half and does not show a substantial amount. This survey also doesn't present the amount of successful athletes who did not use performance-enhancing drugs, such as Michael Jordan and Serena Williams. According to the results of Summer and Winter Olympics, where PEDs are most used, from 1968 to 2012, only 0.70% of the 34,683 athletes tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs. Also, while David gives a lot of examples such as Marion Jones and Alex Rodriguez's experience with PEDs, he fails to mention just how many professional athletes are actually using them. By giving a number, it would demonstrate how big the problem actually is. Without providing a number, it leaves a gray area and does not show that this is an actual problem that requires a discussion, making it irrelevant. My next claim is that the argument needed to address important controversies on the subject. David lists the negative health effects that stimulants, anabolic steroids, and opioids have. With each PED, he gives an example of how they affected a professional athlete. For anabolic steroids, he used Ken Camentini. He used steroids in 1996 and died of a heart attack at age 41, 8 years later. At this point, David should have addressed a strong counter-argument. Even though steroids were determined to be the cause of death, a medical reference from HealthWise noted that anabolic steroids only have negative effects when they are overused or taken illegally. When taken illegally, they can be 10 to 100 times stronger than if they were prescribed. The New York Times did a study that showed that people can also die on overdoses of ibuprofen, which is a widely used anti-inflammatory drug such as Motrin. Like ibuprofen, anabolic steroids are only dangerous if misused, so it should have been addressed what makes steroids different and more dangerous than ibuprofens. For opioids, David uses Ray Lucas as an example. Lucas admitted to taking up to 800 prescription painkillers a month, which is an extreme case. The argument would have been stronger if he used an example that showed a less detrimental case, which would better illustrate how dangerous they are and how would have left no room for argument. In summation, while David's argument regarding performance-enhancing drugs provided a lot of examples and cited reliable sources, it could have been made stronger if it had more relevant information and included important contributions.
All right, well, not quite as extreme as we had earlier. I do think that your speech sometimes is on the brink of being an evaluative response rather than a refutation response. But I do think there are some refutation components in the argument that you present, and so let's emphasize those things first. You do a good job, by the way, setting up what the advocate's claim is and what the secondary points are. But then it sounds like you're going to suggest here's how the argument could be strengthened or here's what needed to be addressed. I think what you want to say is failure to address these things makes the argument weak. Say it that way instead of here's how the argument could have been strengthened. That way the claim that you're making is that the argument is in fact weak and should not be believed. On the first point, you basically say that because it's 40% and not over half, that's unimportant. That's a little bit of a stretch, but I think it's a legitimate press to make on that particular point. Certainly not the majority of athletes or young athletes seem to think that it's necessary necessary, so maybe there's an overgeneralization that's being made here. I thought that the best piece of information that you had in the argument, and the one that most clearly applies on this particular point, was the statistic about the Olympic athletes and the percentage of them who've tested positive between 1968 and 2011 or 2012, I guess it was, and it was an incredibly small percentage. So apparently there's a lot of success and there's not a lot of cheating going on in those situations, and it's only the exaggerated cases that get all the attentions, like the Marion Jones example. I think the point you ought to be making here is that that's the exception, that the advocate's reasoning from an outlier, and in fact it's much more typical that athletes in these circumstances are not likely to be using these performance-enhancing drugs. Then on the argument on the controversy on the negative effects on the PEDs, I thought that you did a good job giving us a little bit of a context. It's not so much that they need to you're denying that there's a harm from PEDs, and yes, certainly Caminetti dies as a result of the use of those kinds of things, but the source of this problem is not the use of it, it's the illegal use of it, which means that it wasn't being controlled by a doctor. It was probably being taken in dosages that would be harmful, and it's not the PED itself that creates the problem, it's the way that it's regulated or controlled that forces people to utilize it in an inappropriate way that creates the problem. I think that would be a way to phrase that claim so it's a little bit clear. That's the argument that you're essentially making, but I think you need to simplify that claim. And then I think that you've got a nice kind of argument diminishing the significance of this, and I think you need the evidence on it about ibuprofen deaths, for instance, that people die from non-prescription medications and prescription medications every day in large numbers, and that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a huge crisis here, that there's something automatically wrong with using ibuprofen. It's the abuse of these things that creates those problems, and certainly the advocate is citing outlier cases again. That one person who's taken 800 prescription opiates in a single month, or painkillers, I guess it is, within a month. That seems to be overdoing it a lot. I guess if you broke it down by the number of pills that they're taking a day, what does that come out to? I'm not good at the math thing. 15 a day, something like that? 20, yeah. It's a lot, That's, you're taking something every hour of the day. That seems to be a lot, and that certainly seems like an outlier case rather than something that is important. And by the way, I'm not exactly sure that that's a PED. So how does it fit into the category? That's the relevance issue that's going on there. So it's a little bit brief. Part of it is because I think you're kind of making the evaluative argument, but there really are counterclaims in here. You just need to be a little bit more effective at expressing those counterclaims. All right, thank you.